Thank you for coming tonight. And I'm going to mute all so we don't get background noise. But if you feel you need to say something, I thought it would be best if we leave questions at the end, then unmute yourself. So good evening. I'm glad you were able to join us. Just to explain who we are, this program is being sponsored by the Guadalupe Regional Group of the Lone Prieta chapter of the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is the local grassroots, where our organizations are local grassroots representation of the club, the nation's largest and oldest environmental organization. It's over a century old now. We work to provide you topics of interest and importance on the environment on these second Wednesdays of the month. Our goal is to educate the public so that we can make us all better informed environmental voters, ideally activists who are willing to take action on a variety of issues. To that end, we are looking for volunteers, if you're interested, to advance our cause. We are active on a number of environmental issues, including taking action to combat climate change, as well as adapt to the changes such as sea level rise. These efforts include a wide range of issues on energy, transportation, and housing. We also pursue the more traditional environmental issues of clean air, water, creek cleanups, preserving Coyote Valley, and restoring and preserving open space. If you'd like to get involved, if you click on chat and just put in your email, then we can get a hold of you and provide the various options. So at this point, I'd like to introduce to you Don Whedon, who's a retired Santa Clara County planner, very experienced in both the practical and the, how we say, academic or the more abstract views of planning. He's worked on the county for 34 years and has been doing lectures like this gratis on the things he's learned. I've asked him to discuss with us how the Valley has evolved to its present state, what problems lie ahead, and how things might evolve, and particularly get his thoughts on what new working patterns I know this is might happen or might stay after COVID-19. I know a lot of people are now working from home. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Don. And go ahead, Don. Don, you have to unmute yourself. Hello, Don. Don, you have to unmute yourself. What happened to Don? Don, you have to unmute yourself.
Don,
yeah,
right,
press *6, Don.
right where you see your picture, you'll see a little red microphone. Click on that.
Ah, all right. Yeah.
Ah, there you are.
Am I on? All right, thank you. There are a couple, the button I was pressing up at the top here was not allowing me to do it, and I thought it might still be under your control. So, all right. Well, the wonders of technology. Well, thank you, Gary, for the introduction. Thank you all for tuning in tonight, and feel free to, you can always turn off your video and leave your picture up there, and then you can wander off and do whatever you want, and it'll still look like you're still paying attention. It's just a little trick I'll share with you at the beginning. I know some of you, and many of you I probably don't. I worked for Santa Clara County Planning for 34 years, and was head of long-range planning for a good deal of that. I've also been involved with the environmental movement in one way or another. I think when I moved out here in 1969, one of the first things I did was join the Sierra Club. So I've been a member for like 50 years now. But since I retired, I've been doing a variety of things. I've given a number of presentations, sort of looking over the horizon at what's coming ahead, not so much retrospectives, but perspectives of what are the things we should be thinking about as we plan the future of our cities, whether we're doing it in some official capacity as a member of a planning commission, or just as an individual who cares about the community, or whether we're a member of the Sierra Club working on advocacy issues. And tonight I want to share sort of a combination of things, a little bit of history, a little bit looking forward, and a little bit of the present time, all relating to around the notion of the suburbs and our suburban model that has sort of guided our lives and controlled our lives in many ways over the last several decades. Part of this presentation was done as sort of a background piece for an urban planning class not too long ago. Part of it is just I've done in the last couple of days, just sort of inspired by current events dealing with social justice and so on. And part of it is from other presentations I've done. So Gary, do you prefer to, if people have some burning questions and want to raise their hand and get your attention, please feel free to interrupt me during the presentation. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and keep going until the end. I really have sort of two presentations. The main body of it is the one dealing with the evolution of the suburbs. And then I have a sort of appendage to that, but a 5-minute, looking at what might be the impacts of the COVID virus on the future of urbanism in the Bay Area in particular. So that's kind of where I'm going with all of this. Let me see now if we can get started here by turning that on and oops. Okay, what is that? All right, so what we have here. Okay. Hold on a second. I want to get rid of you. You're blocking my screen over here. There we go. All right. A brief preamble, as I indicated earlier. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here with the. Not had this problem before. All right, let's go down here. As I said, I've been here in the Valley for 50 years now, and given me some time to kind of think about things over both as they were happening and more so since I've retired. And a couple of things that stand out for me, certainly having watched the evolution of the Bay Area's growth and development has been very interesting, to say the least, and the evolution, if you will, of Silicon Valley, which was just in its infancy when I first moved out here. But also, as one who's been involved in environmental issues, either directly or indirectly for most of that time, it's been interesting to me to see sort of the evolution of the environmental movement, if you will, which was just getting started back in the early 70s when I first got out here. In particular, the attitudes, two attitudes in particular. One is the way in which the environmental community overall has broadened out the definition of sustainability. When I first got here way back when, there was sort of a mental mindset, if you will, that there were environmental issues, there were economic issues, and there were social issues. And there was a wall between them. That if you were an environmentalist, you really focused on the environment and you didn't particularly care about the economic and the social issues. That's an overgeneralization, but that's I think to a large extent was true in the overall mindset. In more recent years, there was an awareness that in fact environmental, social, and economic all need to be thought of together, and hopefully we find solutions that help advance all three of them simultaneously. That you can't have a healthy environment without a healthy economy and without a healthy social structure and so on. And so one of the more specific tangible examples is that housing was once considered to be just a social issue that the environmentalists didn't get involved with. But over time, there was a recognition that housing is in fact an environmental issue, that how and where we house our future population is a really fundamental question as to how well we will protect our environment. And so you've seen manifestation of that in a number of ways in recent years. Sierra Club, Greenbelt Alliance, Save the Bay, League of Conservation Voters have all taken a hand in endorsing or opposing measures that involve housing, particularly in supporting affordable housing measures that have been on local ballots. That's something you would not have seen back in the early days of the environmental movement. Another thing that's just beginning to happen, and this is something I'm sort of put on my watch list to keep an eye on, see how it evolves and whether it achieves its full potential, is out of the linking of social justice and environmental justice. And I was struck by, if you go on the Sierra Club website, if you read the articles in the paper a week or two ago, that the Sierra Club has sort of, in a sense, kind of apologized for not having acknowledged sooner on that John Muir, who was sort of a patron saint of our organization, had himself some fairly racist attitudes, both towards Native Americans and towards blacks, and that does not they wanted to make clear that that was not the values that they represent today. In fact, if you look at their website, you'll see what says on the upper right screen was a screen capture. We fight for environmental and social justice. That's very much a change from the way things were back in the early days of the environment. And in fact, if you looked at the lead into tonight's program, the flyer that was sent out, in the middle of it, it says, "It is our responsibility to use our power to help abolish systemic racism," which is another thing you would not have previously heard from the environmental movement of old. So there's some promise there. I'm holding out a little skepticism to see how that actually plays out in terms of the real world, but I think there's an intention to do the right thing, and that to me is very encouraging. So let's get into how do places evolve and how the suburbs evolve, that fundamental question that's part of that's at the core of my presentation tonight. First of all, sort of in general, make it clear that places exist at many different scales, from the global down to the individual parcel or lot. I'm thinking mostly in terms in this presentation of the regional, county, and citywide level of how those sorts of places change. And all places are, at whatever scale, are shaped by a combination of internal forces, such as their geography, whether they're landlocked by the bay or by mountains or what have you, by their local politics, by their history, as well as external forces ranging from world events, the world economy, and the global environment, such as climate change. So all of these things are things that are constantly working to bring about change. This is sort of a longer list of them, which for simplicity's sake, I refer to as the winds of change. These are the sorts of things that result in the evolution of places over time. And here's an example. Here's what the Santa Clara Valley used to look like back in the 1860s compared to what it looks like today. And all of these forces on the left have one way or another played a role in bringing about that evolution. From a planning standpoint, I think the growth and development of Santa Clara County can be broken into three different eras. Santa Clara County 1.0, if you will, was the pre-suburban era, basically from the Ohlonies up through roughly 1960, somewhat arbitrarily, when we started building the suburbs. The suburban era has been from roughly 1960 until I would say 2010, was the last time when we were more or less not a purely suburban area, but when most of the development was of a suburban nature. Since that time, we've evolved into Santa Clara, what I refer to as Santa Clara County 3.0, which is an urban-suburban hybrid. And what I'm going to talk about next is how did we make that transition? What were the forces that brought about the suburbs, not just in Santa Clara County, but throughout the country? How did that become our predominant model for accommodating growth and development throughout the United States? It involves what I refer to as a dream deferred. And what I mean by that is it's a local story and a national story that began way back in the 1930s, late 1930s, when the Santa Clara Valley looked something like this. It was commonly referred to as the Valley of Heart's Delight. And our economy was largely agricultural, with a few towns scattered around in between, but mostly rural and agricultural. About that time, though, we were in the midst of the Great Depression. In fact, the Great Depression had been going on for almost a decade. At that time, it was a horrible time, incredible unemployment, and again, it had lasted for almost 10 years at that point. And you could see reflections of it both in the deterioration of the housing stock in our cities and the sort of shanty towns that had evolved around many of in the surrounding lands near the city, where basically homeless people had done the best they could to create their own sorts of structure, their own sorts of shelter. But in the midst of all of this gloom and despair and so on, in 1939, it wasn't in the midst, it was toward the end of it. After 10 years of all that despair, there was an event in New York City that changed a lot of things, changed history in a way. It was the 1939 World's Fair, theme of which was building the world of tomorrow. And one of the significant things about it was that there was this pavilion that you're looking at right now, the General Motors Pavilion, which was visited over, I think it was a 2-year period that the fair went on, by about 49 million viewers. So this particular exhibit made a big imprint on many people's mind. And what you saw when you got inside, and you can see there were a lot of people were waiting to get in line there. It was probably one of the most popular attractions back then. Was General Motors' view of the future. And it was what they called the World of the Future diorama. You can see the visitors up in the upper right there looking down on this. It wasn't just a mural. It was a three-dimensional model that had little vehicles running around on those curvilinear streets. It was sort of an introduction to most people of the suburbs, what the suburbs could look like someday. There weren't many of these that existed at that time, but this was the way General Motors presented the future to all these millions of people who came through and visited that particular exhibit. And many of them went away with these little buttons that they gave out that says, "I have seen the future." And I suspect that many of them, if you asked them, should we start building those suburbs right now, would probably have said yes. I mean, that it was such a marked contrast, the freedom that it gave them to drive around and not to be stuck in crowded cities and deteriorating cities and all of that. It was just a very compelling vision that General Motors laid forth in that particular exhibit. But there was a slight obstacle of certainly the Great Depression was still going on at that time, so we couldn't just go out and start building the suburbs. And a year or two later, we'd be in the midst of a world war for several years. So those were sort of temporary barriers. That's why the dream was deferred. We would have probably started trying to build suburbs right away if we hadn't been for these two things. But eventually the war came to an end. And at that time, then we had other challenges as a nation. Well, we've got all these returning veterans. What kind of jobs can we have them? We can't have them keep building tanks because there's no market for that after the war is over, or not the market there was during the war. How do we provide peacetime employment for these returning veterans? And how do we provide housing for the young families that they're creating, which resulted in the baby boom, including that little rascal down there. But you probably noticed the family resemblance there. And at the same time, there was a shortage of housing and vacant land within cities, so you couldn't just build all the new housing in cities. So that there's a need. All of these things sort of led up to how do we solve these problems? How do we create a peacetime economy? How do we deal with the fact that our cities were in kind of bad shape at that time? And also, how do you deal with the fact that people have been cooped up for a long time, living in a very unpleasant situation, and we're looking for a new start, so to speak. And the suburbs provided that opportunity in a number of ways. First of all, there was an ample supply of vacant land around most cities where we could develop the suburbs. There was the growth of the auto industry, which helped provide the employment for the workers coming back, the soldiers coming back, as well as a way to make it possible for people to live in the suburbs. Low gas prices way back then. Baby boom created the demand for housing that helped fuel our transition to a peacetime economy. We had developers at that time, particularly Levittown is one of the most famous ones back in New York, that produced massive subdivisions, built basically the same house or with minor variations by the hundreds. Buildings larger, so building on a larger scale. It wasn't just individual custom-built homes. It was all of these that were built essentially similar plans, a limited number, which allowed them then to make them very inexpensively because they could order large quantities of similar items. You didn't have to have different size cabinets for each house you built. You could use the same cabinets, buy them in quantity, and sell a very cheap house. I think one of the ads for the homes back then was that you could get one of the homes in Levittown for like $6,000 was the price. We also had about that same time the building of the interstate highway system, which was initially justified as being sort of a military highway. After World War II, we saw how easy it was for the Germans, at least until we bombed things over there, for them to use the Autobahn to get things, troops and so on, materiel across country very quickly. And Dwight Eisenhower, who I've heard this story a couple of years ago, back in the early, after he was a soldier in World War I and early in his career, he had done a trip to, the military had sent him across country with a group to sort of see how easy would it be for them to move troops across country. And they found it was not very easy at all. And so his own personal experience plus the World War II experience led him to take, when he became president, to sign the legislation that led to the creation of the interstate highway system, which then opened up land, a number of places that would have been inaccessible otherwise, to building shopping centers, strip malls, and so on. And there was the GI Bill, which provided loan guarantees. You can see the sort of ad in the upper right here, veterans. If you're buying a farm, a home, or business, learn about these guaranteed loans. This was a major thing that provided, as well as for education, there was opportunities for that. So a lot of things that were sort of promised to the returning veterans, including sort of subsidized loans, which made it easy for them to move to the suburbs. And we had a young population with very few older non-driving people. So being concerned about the fact that we were becoming automobile dependent really wasn't an element back then. And so the suburbs were born, and along with a new way of life that has been with us for the last 60 years or more. Essentially, the critical point here, I think, is it was a genius idea in many ways because it met the need of the day, the need to provide peacetime employment, the need to get our economy going and jump-started after the Depression and all of that. And all of those things worked marvelously well. So in that sense, it certainly has been a success. Why Santa Clara County? Why did we become suburban? There were some specific things here that also blended in. One of which was that during World War II, we had a great many soldiers who were either stationed in California or passed through here during the war. And while they were here, they saw this. And when they got back, things like this, and when they got back, the war was over and they got back home to Minnesota or Iowa, and it was December, and they're looking out at the bleak skies and the 3 feet of snow and wondering what to do with their lives. It was kind of an easy decision that this was really a magnet for people to come and find jobs here. And fortunately for them, it was at the beginning of our aerospace industry. Both Hewlett Packard and Lockheed were major employees in the Valley and hiring lots of people. So that too fueled it. It wasn't that they'd come out here and be unemployed. There were jobs for them, and also jobs in the construction and real estate and so on, like all of these. The land development, as it turns out, particularly if you're doing subdivisions, is an extremely has an awful lot of incidental benefits to it, and where the amount of money that's spent up front ripples through the economy. But I think this one here, you see the sign in the upper left. This was a subdivision over in East San Jose back then, and you may have noticed the $95 moves you in sign. Wow, those were the days. And that was the very fine print there says GI. That if you'd been a veteran and you got a GI loan, you could move into a new house in East San Jose for $95. So as a result of all of these things happening, Santa Clara County went from 1950, a population under 300,000 people, to a population over 1 million people by 1970 in just 2 decades. And during that time, then the landscape, this is the way our cities looked, the incorporated areas, the